You'll remember back in 2019, the president called for a federal national emergency at the border to be able to access more federal funding for his border wall. And then in 2018, he did call for military troops along the border, though the Pentagon at the time insisted that they were there more for logistical support rather than to be able to apprehend undocumented migrants. How much further this plan could go in this next Trump administration is still the big question, especially as we continue to see more immigration hardliners added to this next Trump administration, Jose.
And Ryan, meanwhile, just this morning, we're learning the House Ethics Committee is set to meet Wednesday to discuss its report on Matt Gaetz. What can we expect?
It's an open question right now, Jose, because the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has suggested that it would open up Pandora's box if the committee were to release this report after Matt Gaetz, who's the subject of this investigation, stepped down from Congress. This despite the fact that there has been precedent. The committee has released reports on members who've already left office, at least on 2 different other occasions. And there's a continuing groundswell of support from Senate Republicans to see the contents of that report. Maybe they don't see the report itself, but they at least want the underlying evidence that went into this report, which could include the transcribed interviews with some of these witnesses, including witnesses that have testified to some of Gaetz's conduct. So this is going to be a very difficult position, and we could see kind of a bicameral spat between the House and the Senate as the Senate insists on seeing this material if the House wants to keep it under wraps. It's important to keep in mind, Jose, the Ethics Committee is equal parts Republican and Democrat, so it's not a majority-minority committee. It's the one committee in the House in which you have the same number from both parties. So it would just take one Republican to break with the rest of his party in order to see that report released. We'll have to see what they come up with on Wednesday.
And Ryan, I mean, and listening to the Speaker on this issue, it remains unclear whether that report has been concluded or not.
Yeah, I think that is another part of this, right, Jose? There is some speculation that they were moving toward wrapping up their investigation and putting the finishing touches on this report, which is part of the reason, perhaps, that the former Congressman Matt Gaetz stepped down from his position, which happened to coincide with the president-elect naming him as the next attorney general. Those are all part of this investigation. And the second that he's no longer a member of Congress, they no longer have jurisdiction. They have no way to enforce whatever they drew as a conclusion as a result of this report. Still, that evidence still exists. It's something they still compiled, so it is something that the Senate could use as part of their confirmation process.
And Ryan, any reaction from Capitol Hill on these new details about Pete Hegseth?
It's still kind of bubbling right now, Jose, but I can tell you that Senate Republicans have said that they want all of these potential nominations to go through a rigorous vetting process, and that includes FBI background checks. That includes an investigation by the Senate Judiciary Committee or whatever committee the particular nominee would be going through. In this case, it would be Armed Services for Pete Hegseth. So the Senate wants all the information, and that would include this information that has now come to light about this alleged sexual assault and encounter with Hegseth denies any wrongdoing. It is just all part of this process. And the big question we have not figured out yet, Jose, is just how much Congress will assert its right as a co-equal branch of government, and particularly the Senate, when it comes to advise and consent. Do they view the loyalty to Donald Trump and his administration as their top priority, or do they put these nominees through a rigorous process before they vote yes on their confirmation?
And Ali, meanwhile, the president-elect has named his picks for other key cabinet positions. Who've been chosen, and what are the key roles we're still waiting on?
Yeah, Jose, we saw this steady stream of announcements continue over the weekend with the president-elect picking fracking company CEO Chris Wright as energy secretary, also picking the FCC's top Republican Brendan Carr to lead that independent agency. And he's also promoting some top communications people from his campaign to join him in the White House, promoting Caroline Leavitt to become what will be the youngest White House press secretary in history at just 27 years old. And at this point, Trump has announced picks for more than half of his cabinet, but there are still some top jobs still yet to be named, including the positions of secretaries of labor, education, and treasury, just to give you a few examples.
Ali Rafa and Ryan Nobles, thank you both so very much. And joining us now, Mark McKinnon, former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain. He is the creator of The Circus on Showtime, and Victoria de Francesco Soto, the dean of the Clinton School of Public Service at the University of Arkansas. So, Mark, first on Trump's confirmation that he plans on using military assets to conduct mass deportations. Ali Rafa was telling us about how in 2019 and 2018, Trump mentioned doing something like that. But is there any precedent for something as broad-based as using military assets for deportations?
Thanks, Jose. Well, I think the one thing we know is that Trump's going to do everything within the law and perhaps beyond the law. He's going to revert to a 1798 law called the Alien Enemies Act, which has been used several times, but in true acts of war. But the definition is not just declared acts of war. It's also for attempted invasion or predatory incursions. And you can certainly imagine how Trump would expand the definition under this administration. This was used in 1955 when the then President Eisenhower tried to use the military and was barred from that. But in Operation Wetback, they chose to use National Guard troops as a way of enforcing these laws. And given what we've seen in recent past, Jose, with particularly Republican governors in support of Donald Trump, Kristi Noem comes to mind, where yet a North Dakota governor sending National Guard troops to Texas. So I think the answer is that he will do anything and everything within his power and beyond his power, and certainly test his powers, because this was the first thing he talked about coming down the escalator in 2016, and it's the last thing he talked about in 2020. This is his top priority, Jose.
Yeah, and Victoria, with that top priority and the vast power of the executive, how do you see this, essentially confirmation that the president-elect made just this morning that he would be using military assets?
Right. And so this is something that he had talked about, to Mark's earlier point. And also, it's something not entirely new from a historical sense. So Mark mentioned Operation Wetback, whereas we did not see the actual military being used. At the time, we had seen the head of Border Patrol under Eisenhower wanting to use it, was desperate to use it, and actually he was held back. So there had already been a conceptual framework for doing that when there was a perceived crisis on the border. That being said, let's think about the magnitude. The high estimates of Operation Wetback were at about 1 million, even though folks think that the actual numbers were closer to about 500,000. Now think about today, where we estimate about 20 million undocumented individuals in the United States. So I really am scratching my head and thinking about what this would look like in terms of the scale and the size, bureaucratically speaking, in terms of this. And I think this is why Donald Trump is going to try to justify the use of the military, surely because of the scale, in addition to how he is labeling this as an affront on the national sovereignty of the United States.
And Victoria, meanwhile, the Trump team appears to be standing behind the president-elect's pick for Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. How big of an obstacle do you think this is going to be for his confirmation?
I think that in this instance, we have a Senate that is majority Republican. The Senate is trying to assert his power, but the president is asserting that he has a mandate. He won the popular vote. He won the electoral college vote. The other piece of this, Jose, is that you see a number of new senators that have come in after Trump's first administration. So I do think that there is a different climate. I'm in a toss-up right now whether how much pushback there's going to be, but compared to where we were maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I do see a potential path for this controversial nominee.
And Mark, how do you see it? Is there a path forward for this nominee? What about other controversial ones? And I'm thinking, for example, Gates.
Well, Jose, I think it's pretty clear that that people in Republican circles feel they have a huge mandate, and that they're going to turn on the fire hoses from MAGA land if anybody tries to resist any of these nominations, as problematic as they may be. And it's just hard, given the results of the election, it's going to be very difficult for anybody to stand up to these nominations. I mean, Lisa Murkowski comes to mind, and a couple of others, but they're going to get a absolute, flamethrowers coming from Trump supporters on these nominations. So they're really going to have to be sturdy to stand up. And, Mitch McConnell may throw in his weight in for one last hurrah, but the Senate is proud of its process, but I think that this is a case where politics is going to trump everything. And I think that Trump will push through, all these nominations. He's not going to back off for sure. The most problematic, of course, is Matt Gaetz. But we'll see what happens. But I think in the long run, I bet on most of those confirmations going through.
I mean, even DNI. I mean, I'm thinking Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, do you think those will have, Mark, any different kind of nomination obstacles?
I really don't, Jose. I mean, I think that if anything, I think what could happen is that Gaetz might go down for, all the obvious reasons, and then he becomes the sacrificial lamb that allows everybody else to go through.
Mark McKinnon, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, thank you both so very much. Appreciate it. Up next, sounding the alarm. New reporting on what DOJ and FBI officials are doing right now to prepare for the incoming Trump administration. Overseas, a major escalation in Russia's war on Ukraine as President Biden clears the way for Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike at Russia. And later, a shocking display as a group shouted racist slurs and carried Nazi flags during a march in Columbus, Ohio. We're getting White House reaction this morning. We're back in 90 seconds. You're watching Jose Díaz-Balart Reports on MSNBC.
Boll and Branch sheets are incredibly soft, made of the finest materials on earth, to get softer and softer with every wash. Whatever your dreams may be, dream them in Boll and Branch. With our best offers of the year.
I spent half my life in prison, and that's time we can't get back.
I was embedded with Bronx homicide detectives. There were dozens of police reports that were withheld. And I see one that is a bombshell.
Go out there and find the facts in my case. You'll find that I'm innocent.
There's no way he can't be in New York and Florida at the same time.
I felt a responsibility to get to the truth. When I did my investigation, the only evidence was one woman's eyewitness testimony. It is impossible to have seen what she said she saw.
I've been sitting in here wondering whether this mistake will be corrected.
It happens over and over.
What's it gonna take?
Once an innocent person is convicted, it's nearly impossible to get justice.
At that moment, I knew that I was never gonna go back home.
I cry because it's an injustice. Enough is enough! Free the innocent! Free the innocent!
15 past the hour. During the presidential campaign, Donald Trump threatened to investigate, even prosecute or imprison and otherwise punish his perceived enemies. But now President-elect seems to be walking that back, saying in a new interview with Fox News Digital, quote, "I am not looking for a retribution, grandstanding, or to destroy people who treated me very unfairly or even badly beyond comprehension." However, his selection of former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz to be Attorney General has heightened some fears of potential revenge prosecutions. So much so that NBC News is